Hey, everybody. It's Michael Cartwright. Welcome to the Crossing the Chasm podcast. We're seeking reconciliation and reformation through exploring points of intersection and commonality. As you can see, my surroundings are a little different than usual. I'm in a hotel on a business trip, but I really just wanted to put this episode together for you, finish it off. I've been sitting on the interview, but I just wanted to get this intro out of the way and get this out to you. I'm in a transition period right now. My family, we're going to be moving from Dallas to Columbus here in the next couple of weeks, so it's going to be busy where I'm not going to have time to put this together any later than right now. So I wanted to get this out to you guys real quick. So today we're going to continue the conversations in the chasm segment. This will be our second episode of this segment, and I'm interviewing Mark Nanos. And I got a little bit here about Mark Nanos. He's a Jewish historian with a research focus on the Apostle Paul. His research involves investigating ways to read Paul's letters within Judaism during the mid-first century, re-conceptualizing how to interpret Paul with major implications in regard to the views of Jews and Judaism within Christianity. Dr. Nanos, he holds a PhD from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and he holds a honorary PhD from the University of Lund in Sweden. He is a winner of the National Jewish Book Award for Christian and Jewish Relations, and he is the co-founder of the Paul Within Judaism section in the Society of Biblical Literature. He has authored books such as The Mystery of Romans, The Irony of Galatians, Paul Within Judaism, and a multi-volume work titled Reading Paul Within Judaism. In today's episode, we will be discussing one of his recent papers titled Reframing Paul's Opposition to Erga Nomou as Rites of Custom for Proselyte Conversion Completed by the Synecdoche Circumcision. This episode is going to be a little bit of a longer one, but I hope you guys enjoy it. I think that it will improve your understanding of such books as Romans and Galatians and give you understanding of Paul and the New Testament in general. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I'd really appreciate if you guys give me some feedback. If you learned anything, if you found it valuable, let me know. And God bless. Thanks. At this endeavor, I was trying to memorize the book of Romans, but and it wasn't. I wasn't successful in the endeavor, but I got through about the first 5 chapters, and there's something about memorizing that, like,
Yep.
you start to like get the train of thought. You see the train of thought in a whole different way than before.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that popped out that was that I didn't notice before is that Paul, he certainly does talk about the Jewish people a lot. And then I'm like, where are these Jews? Why don't I see any Jews in my church?
Mm-hmm.
And I would ask people in my congregation about it, and they didn't really have any answers, didn't really think it was important. And so it kind of took me on this journey. And so when I'm like over 10 years in the journey, still a lot to learn, but I want to expose other people to what I've learned in this journey. So that's why I wanted to have you on this podcast of crossing the chasm between Christianity and Judaism. Now, your paper and all your work, I feel like it addresses some ideas that can aid us in crossing the chasm between Christianity and Judaism. And before we jump into your paper, I'd like to kind of contextualize our discussion. If you could, please, can you like share your journey and how you got to this journey of reading Paul within Judaism?
Well, yeah, really short, briefly, I was in a class in which we were reading Jewish biblical and Second Temple Jewish texts, like Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth, that were focused on eschatological and apocalyptic themes. And it was obvious that much of the language was prescriptive for, and it involved criticizing those in leadership or other points of view of other fellow Israelites or fellow Jews, or their behavior. And no one in the class, it just wasn't logical to question whether they left Israelite commitment or Judaism or being Jewish, or nobody, that just wasn't a question that you would ask. It was obvious that they were within the movement, and they were appealing to the ideals of the movement to criticize other people. And
Mm,
so I was aware of Paul's language in Romans 11, especially about Israel being saved. And so I wrote a paper about that, and I knew enough Greek. I had spent some of my teenage years in the island of Crete, Greece. My dad had been working there,
okay.
and I knew enough Greek to get lexicons and to sort of look at the passage and say, you know, um, it's not just a positive theme. It actually hasn't probably not been translated very well. I didn't have the skills, to offer it, but my basic premise, which is still kind of my basic question that I'm pursuing, is if we assume that Paul, like Isaiah or Jeremiah or some other prophet that we're familiar with, is functioning within the movement and appealing to the ideals, and that his criticisms are in-house and not having converted, left it, and from outside, how would we read this language? What does he really mean? What is he really trying to do? And who's he? And as I got more sophisticated later, when I came back to what beginning to write what became the mystery of Romans, um, I I realized, you really have to understand who the audience was. Whereas for the prophets, it was fellow Jews or Israelites or whatever, generally speaking. For Paul, it wasn't. It was these non-Jews who had entered into a Jewish movement, and he was enculturating them. And so that changes the rhetorical aspects as well. And that's really the question that's really at center of my rereadings of Paul is a set of premises. What if what Paul was doing, he thought was Pharisaic Judaism, just like he'd done before, but now with convictions about messianic claims,
Right.
and believing that the end of the ages had arrived, that the other nations therefore should worship the same one Creator God, but remain members of the other nations. And that would be what the world would look like in the end. That's the way he could piece together the prophets. That's one way you could piece them together to answer what he thought was happening in the world. And if that's true for him, and if the people to whom he writes the letters that we read, although we read them in translation and none of the original autographs, well, that if they knew him to be a Torah observant, Pharisaic type Jew who believed Jesus was Messiah and that the time had come to bring other nations to oh, a very Pharisaic way of life, but as non-Jews, how would they have read and understood his correspondence? Which would be totally different than the premises that most people open his letters with. And so that's essentially, my journey, and it continues to be my journey. There's these flashpoint texts that made it clear to everyone, and made it seem to me in the beginning that it was unlikely my set of assumptions, my hypothesis was likely to bear out. But as I work on each flashpoint text and go back and look at the language he used and go back and look at the larger argument, as you had mentioned, memorizing something, you begin to be aware of the larger argument that these little words and sentences fit into, where
Right.
someone's going, instead of picking apart one little point in the argument that might not even be the direction the person wants to bring you in the end, but might be a shared premise from which they plan to change your mind. That's the way arguments work. So that has really motivated me. I now think it's a very probable hypothesis that this was Paul, and that's how he was known, and how he would have been decoded. His language would have been decoded by most of the original um, readers and listeners, at least the ones that knew him, which
Right.
brings up Romans as interesting because maybe most of them didn't actually know him and maybe had to write a little bit differently. Oh, and one more thing is I really took seriously something that still is not taken that seriously in Pauline scholarship, and that is Paul used secretaries, which means that whoever
Okay.
Paul was and whatever his competence was and whatever he was trying to communicate is in a formal as well as functional hand of trained people trained in certain kind of correspondence in antiquity. It was actually a specialty. And that means that we have a hand between Paul and the Greek,
Mm,
in addition to the 150 years gap from anything original.
right.
We have another hand, and that might explain a lot of things. And we have forms of letter writing style. Yeah, like we have a Dear John letter, right? And people know
Right.
when you read, "Hey, you're a wonderful person," but they know where this is going. Actually, when they read "You're a wonderful person" in the first line, they probably know where this is going. It's a form, right? You recognize it.
Right.
Likewise, in antiquity, almost all letters, because most people couldn't read, had formulas. And I take this seriously so that um, it's harder to talk about Paul's personality. We have the personality of a certain letter style in order to communicate a certain thing. So these kinds of complications and these kinds of interests in reading and then asking about, Jewish letter forms, Greek and Roman letter forms, and so on, really shape how you would then look at these flashpoint texts regarding Paul's relationship with the Torah or Judaism or Jewish identity and so on. What is he trying to do, and how is he constrained to doing that by his cultural context and the way communication was done?
Right. Wow.
Not
Yeah,
sure.
that's real interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's something I never heard of before, the different forms of letters.
Yeah,
And
well,
that there.
my Irony of Galatians, which was my dissertation, PhD dissertation,
Uh,
reformulated, will show you that game, and
okay.
that'll get you into some bibliography for people who really specialize in that.
Okay. So before I one more question before we jump into the Erga Nomou argument. Um, why do you think it's important for Christians to read Paul within Judaism?
Oh, another short answer, right? Um, the first answer to this is really an ethical one. Um, we should always represent a person as well as we can. We should be true to that person, right? We should let their voice be their voice and not make it what we want it to be.
Right.
And so the very first thing is just there's a historical quest to get Paul as right as we can get him. What did he mean? And the reason why he's important is because he's been important to shaping not only Christian culture but Western culture and therefore global culture because Western culture conquered the world, so to speak. And so, uh, first of all, it's just a historical. Hey, listen, what if the voice of Paul has been misunderstood for 2 millennia and has shaped the world in directions that it believes are by God's from God's voice, so to speak, or represent God's guidance and opinion on things that are misreading him and misunderstanding who he was, what he did in his context. So first of all, it's just be true to the man, true to a historical task. And that actually was part of my awakening to after school when I was just a businessman and hadn't pursued the postgraduate degree that I had kind of thought about doing, was realizing that if I'm right about Paul, my hunch is right about Paul, it would have dramatic impact not only for getting the historical Paul right, but the second part of this, which is for changing culture around things that people think are self-evidently true to Paul's voice and to early Christianity, if those matter to them. And there's a billion Christians in the world, so there's a lot of people it matters to. and they impact the lives of a lot of other people, but also of each other. The way that they understand Christianity has marginalized and harmed a lot of their own,
Right.
as well as obviously the Jewish people, and has if their self-identity and group identity has been established based on a misunderstanding and mischaracterization, a kind of foil of Jews and Judaism, so that they can demonstrate their superiority and their difference. And if Paul was, in fact, a Jew doing Judaism, and that's the origins of the movement, well, that would cause some recalculation of self-identity and group identity, some need for a cross-cultural engagement of his texts, re-investigating his texts, and rethinking what Christian culture maybe should look like if it was going to be true to that historical figure's voice. So that's
Right.
kind of a big deal. So
Yeah.
me as a Jewish person, I have to be a little careful and respectful as an outsider. Um, but I think the payoffs for Christians are enormous, and I certainly think the payoffs for the people that Christians affect are enormous. And so that's why I moved from business back into finishing a PhD and making this my life's work, because
Hmm.
kind of a humanitarian project. Um, some people take that as an entry to dismiss my voice, because it's just an interested point of view that's modern or postmodern, or shaped by current concerns, which it is, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother with it, and nor
Right.
would you or any of your listeners if they didn't have an interested point of view in what it means for them today.
Right.
But the point is that it's always been interested. All the translations and interpretations that are familiar and self-evidently the case were interested at some point of view in their context and what Paul's voice meant to them.
Right.
You
Right.
can't escape that. Otherwise you wouldn't bother with him. I mean, how many my life could have been given to studying some Cicero or whoever else it is that his historical figure. But
Right.
he shaped the world in many ways too, but not as profoundly as Paul's voice continues to be an authority for many people, a guiding light for what they
Right.
should be like.
So in a sense, if your view is true and Christianity was to accept it, it would be world changing.
I think it would be profoundly different. Yeah, it would
Yeah.
creates a lot of issues to be negotiated in the hermeneutics. What does that mean for me now? Because Christianity is not Judaism, and it's not going to go back to being Judaism.
Right.
So it has to then have some separation from its original voices. It has to negotiate what it ought to be, what its ideals should be, and how should it maybe reshape itself, as Christianity, not as Judaism,
Right.
which is quite a task, not one that I'm up to offering very much on. But just to say, hey, don't you think you should do it if that's true to the man and to the movement, and therefore to those of you who believe in Jesus, to the Jesus movement. You
Right.
know, how could you be untrue to that? Just because you want to perpetuate what you already believe in? Is that moral? Is that
No.
really where where you want to be?
No. Um, so
No,
hopping
no,
into
just excuse me, just say one more
oh,
thing. That
okay,
that
okay.
means all I'm really saying is don't dismiss that which you don't like, that's unfamiliar. Um, some of us are doing the hard exegetical work to challenge you to rethink these things. And so if your first impulse is to not like it or to be defensive or whatever, that's understandable. But question yourself and your own integrity. If you don't investigate it, or if you keep others from thinking it's even worth investigating by whatever methods you choose, you should question yourself. If you really say the Bible matters to me and I want to be led by the scriptures, or I want to hear Paul's voice, or I want to hear God's voice through these texts, then you ought to be beholden to getting them as right as you can. And we're saying you haven't gotten them as right as they could be gotten. At least you
Right.
should take the challenge seriously. We're not just like out here we're in conversation with the traditions, and we're looking at those texts and trying to understand them. So the challenge is not to be dismissive, not to just look to find fault, but to really see if there's something here and be curious and take it seriously.
Right. Yeah. So, it seems like I've noticed just in my experience in seminary and schooling that sometimes education can be indoctrination,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, and sometimes certain ideas are just kind of like, no, we don't believe that. But
Hmm.
true education is really knowing all the points of views and understanding them, and
That's
then
right.
from there, coming to a conclusion.
That's right. Right. And
Right.
if you're going to keep with a certain confession, that's fine, but you should be informed. You should know what choice you're making
Right. Right.
about that confession, rather than being ignorant about it and just swallowing the propaganda. It's called
So,
apologetics. It put the nice word apologetics on it, but it's just propaganda.
right. So in your paper, there's a part in the paper where you talk about how the traditional and new perspective, they universalize Paul's rhetoric to kind of apply to everybody.
Right. Mhm.
Could you kind of elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the things about rhetoric. When we make an argument, let's just say you mentioned you have some daughters. When you have, let's just say, two children, your daughters are young, but you can imagine this. Let's say you have two teenage daughters, and one is a party personality. On Saturday night, is out late with the friends partying, and the other is a bookworm. On Saturday night, is at home reading books. To the bookworm, you're likely to say something like, "Hey, why don't you get out? Make some friends, get out like your sister, and party a little bit." And to the other sister, what are you going to say? Why don't you maybe occasionally read a book and be a bit like your sister?
Hmm.
Now, are you contradicting yourself, or are you are you a parent who is engaging two different people where they are with an ideal that you want to bring them back to in balance? So when we read Paul's texts, they're written to specific people in specific situations that he can't be there in person. Had he been there, able to be there in person, we wouldn't have his letters. Uh,
Right.
we have his letters because he wasn't able to be there in person, and he is concerned enough about something that he needs to communicate it. And so we're lucky to get these communications. But if we read what you wrote to the one who's a bookworm, and we don't have the other one, then we'll think you want everybody to be a partier. That's your personality. That's what you think the ideals are. And if we read only the
Mhm.
other, we think everyone should be a bookworm. That's universalizing. And we only have this small amount of data to try to develop what Paul's views were from. And we need to really first really try to contextualize it as much as we can. Who's he speaking to? What's the situation? What's he trying to do? What kind of persuasive techniques? So the one daughter says to you, well, when you were a teenager, you were always partying. And so then you've got to answer back with some way to qualify. And so you give a personal anecdote. Now, is that personal anecdote going to be about partying? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's going to be about something else. And so, are we supposed to universalize that? Are we supposed to say that's what your daughter did, whatever you did, or vice versa? No,
Mhm.
we're in a communication. And
Right.
unfortunately, people in the Christian tradition, of course, are looking for universals. And that's perfectly reasonable. But let's not make Paul make a universal. Let's let Paul make a particular that he's doing. That's what conversations are like. That's what letters were. They were conversations, one side of a conversation. But they anticipated, whatever was behind, whatever they thought they knew about the situation and the person, and they anticipated responses because they didn't get to just send the next email.
Right.
I mean, they got to cover the ground of where they think this is going to go and what kind of response it's going to get from the people to whomever they've advised to behave differently than the other people in the situation I think they should behave. So yes, this is part of the deal. Then you universalize. And the other thing is a big deal, of course, what was happening in German theology in the 19th century with issues of nationalism and so on, that Bauer's thesis and others impact this idea that Judaism was particularistic in a way that Christianity was universalistic. That is to say, it was only for Jews and you had to be a Jew, whereas Christianity was for everybody. So it gave up the Jewish stuff. Well, that means it's not for Jews. And people don't realize it's just as particularistic. It just changed what the particulars are.
Right.
Instead of Torah-based or Jewish cultural norms, it's Christian-based and Christian cultural norms, which are basically Gentile, non-Jewish cultural norms. So there's that kind of universalism that's also a problem. And the biggest challenge, of course, for a regular person who can't read Greek, and even for someone who can read Greek, if they don't actually go back and look at how the Greek words were used, but the glosses they learned in seminary or wherever they learned Greek, is to actually get to what that person in their context was probably trying to communicate, which may not have anything to do with you. I mean, how many Christians in churches today are concerned about circumcision, whether they should be circumcised or not? It's a medical procedure that happens to you when you're a baby or not, or older because there's some kind of medical reason to do it. But it doesn't have to do with identification the same way it does in Paul's text. And so those things don't seem to matter. Well, interestingly enough, then you universalize circumcision to being what Christians are, the true circumcision or spiritual circumcision or whatever. And you're not dealing with what Paul's language was about. Why was that such a big deal?
Right.
So I hope that's some kind of an answer. It's a part of one at least.
And so talking about circumcision, that's where we get into Erga Nomou, which is usually translated as works of the law. And you're proposing that it should be translated as a rite of a custom.
Right. Customary rites of a custom.
Right.
Yeah. And what is the custom? That's at issue. So let's talk about this. So we have two words, erga and nomou, that are put together in this phrase. Erga is a plural, usually translated works. Often the article is added, though Paul doesn't use the article in most of the cases, almost all the cases that he contrasts it with. All the cases they contrast it with pistis, which is usually translated faith, but should be probably faithfulness or loyalty or trust. So there's erga, and then there's nomou, which is from nomos, which is usually translated law, singular, but it's in the genitive, nomou. So we throw the of in there in English. So it's normally the works of the law, although there's no article before either of those words. So it should be, with the normal translation, it should be works of law. And by works, they mean deeds, or human accomplishment is often used to describe it. That is, humans trying to do things to please God in the Protestant sort of fashion, and in the Augustinian Catholic understanding, which Luther, of course, was an Augustinian priest. And so the usual meaning creates a binary between faith, trusting in Jesus alone, as Luther introduced the word, which makes sense in German to introduce alone. It's German language style, versus works of law, meaning in the most concise sense, Jewish Torah observance, but it's generally extended into either, as it was often emphasized by the Catholics, and it's true in Protestant tradition, as the ceremonial kind of laws, rituals, which is actually closer to what I'll come back and argue, but not generalized to all rituals, just a specific ritual. And it's then generalized from that into all kinds of performances of good things. That somehow is something God wouldn't like, because that would be somehow a threat to God's sovereignty. And if I may just stop here for a moment, I'm making fun of that because I find it incomprehensible as a parent that I would be somehow challenged by my child choosing to want to do good things, initiating being nice to another child, and without me telling them to do it or enabling them to do it. Somehow that would be a threat to my parentness.
Right.
The concept of God that comes out in this kind of language, if you just stop and think about it. How is that an insult to God that you I just
Right.
can't stand it. I think God would be really happy if people wanted to please God and do what God wanted them to do. I think that
Right.
it just makes sense to me. And actually, Christian theology, while it has this technical kind of way, in reality, what's every sermon asking you to do is to do the right thing. So anyhow,
Right.
but somehow it's different than Judaism. Somehow doing the right thing is wrong because it's for the wrong motives or whatever. So works of the law is a translation that signifies a kind of a whole concept of what's wrong with Jews and Judaism. It's a way of living that's based on trying to do things, do the right things. And Paul doesn't want you to do that. Obviously, if you read his argument, that he wants you just to believe or to trust or to be faithful, not to do that. Now, as you move towards faithful for pistis, you start to see the problem here, because being faithful is doing the right thing that's expected of you by the parent in the family relationship or by the partner in the marriage covenantal relationship. And so what I've tried to do in retranslating this as customary rites, rites, as in rituals, or rites of a custom, to try to be closer to, you're looking for translation equivalents, and you sometimes want to be closer to the literal when you're introducing a challenge to what's more than just familiar. It's theological jargon. So I think customary rites would be easier, but the rites of a custom to try to stay closer to the Greek. And what is the custom? And now, by the way, the word nomos, which is translated law, if you would look in lexicons, who were written by people who are probably Christians, even if they're classical scholars, Anglicans or whatever, in Britain or in Germany, Lutherans and so on. Even they, in the lexicons, recognize that nomos mostly means things like custom. A law is a custom that's been formalized. It's the way people do, right? We have a law becomes what everyone eventually codifies.
Right.
And so custom is useful, and first of all, because it breaks out, makes it defamiliarizes and makes us stop and think, oh, what does Paul write? And rights, because what Paul is talking about here are the rights involved in non-Jews becoming Jews, or what we might call proselyte conversion, proselyte transformation. And it's used this way, although it's works is fine. We use ergonomic for a chair that fits right, that works with your way your body is designed.
Right.
And so in this case, we have Paul talking about circumcision. The issue is completing. Will you be in Galatians 3? Will you be completed in the flesh, that which you started by what's usually translated in various ways, but basically, faithful obedience to the gospel. And so the issue is, will you complete in the flesh? That is to say, this is literal. Will you get circumcised? Which is the culminating act in this rites of passage. It's not the only act in rites of passage, and rites of passage are complicated, right? Because when someone's going to transfer into a different cultural or religious community and become signified, like say become a Catholic, they're going to go through a long process of rites of conversion. and they're going to change their lifestyle. It involves activity too. If they keep acting in the old ways, they're not going to complete the process. They're not going to be allowed to.
Right.
And so when they complete the process, they're different in a way that they weren't prior to the process. But it's not just because they act differently. They already have probably changed their activity. That's a cultural change. One's a religio-ethnic change. That is, when you complete the passage, you become a Jew of some kind. Some Jews might say you're not a Jew yet, or you're always kind of an outsider. That's a normal anthropological, sociological issue. But technically, those who were advocating proselyte conversion, which was obviously the context Paul was dealing with in Galatia and in Rome, that some people were advocating that these non-Jews who believed in Messiah, if they want to be full members of the Jewish community, they need to become Jews, proselyte conversion. Well, that was a custom. Now, here's the thing, Michael. It's not enjoined in Torah. Torah does not give proselyte conversion. It's nowhere described, nowhere commanded, nowhere enjoined. So calling it a custom helps to bring out the salience of the fact that it was developed in the Greek and in the Roman period that Paul is in as a new thing that was happening in the diaspora. As non-Jews were attracted to Jewish communities, how can they negotiate this religio-ethnic boundary? Can they become Jews? Can they become Catholics? I mean, you can go to Catholic Church all you want, and you can be more Catholic than all the Catholics there. And culturally, you can practice birth control the way that, the Catholic Church formally says it, which most of the Catholics in the pews apparently don't do, according to the surveys. But that won't make you a Catholic. But completing the conversion process will make you a Catholic, and then you may or may not act just like all the other Catholics do, less Catholic than you did before, perhaps even. It won't make you not a Catholic. Well, in the case of these Jewish communities of Paul's time, it was becoming normal. It was becoming a cultural custom to provide a way for non-Jews to negotiate this religio-ethnic identity. And so Paul, I think, is using nomos here actually in a sort of ironic he's kind of actually teasing at the fact that this is not Torah. It's the rites of a custom that's a cultural convention that's growing along. That's why I think he associates it with Hagar actually in his allegory, because that was a cultural convention that if a wife couldn't provide the heir, you could use the slave woman to provide the heir. But it actually creates as many problems as it solves. If you believe God's going to actually complete the promise, it's going to turn out to be more of a problem then. So Paul is playing with, in Erga Nomou, if we read it as rites of a custom or customary rites related to completion of the proselyte conversion process, if we just put that gloss in there to keep us, or if we just even don't use it, we use circumcision. And circumcision is a Synecdoche. It's a way of talking about the culminating rite for a male in this process of conversion.
Right.
So if we would just talk about proselyte conversion, a slight anachronism for Paul, because we don't have the conversion rites outlined until later in the Talmud in the 2nd, 3rd century, 4th century. But we know it's happening because Paul's saying not to do it.
Right.
And that's usually universalized to Paul saying there's something inadequate or wrong or passé about Jewish identity. Circumcision doesn't matter, being Jewish doesn't matter, but that's not the point. The point is, if you, as members of the other nations, have turned to the one creator God, you represent the other nations. If you become circumcised, this is what I think Paul's theology is, and that's what I write about. If you become circumcised, you collapse this into God is still only the God of Israelites, of Jews, of the circumcised. Isn't he the God also of the nations, is how Romans 3 argument proceeds at the end.
Right.
Yeah, of course he is. Therefore, you have to keep in these communities, if they claim to represent the age to come community of the people of God, of the creator God, they have to have non-Jews as well as Jews. So Erga Nomou, Paul's resistance to Erga Nomou is not, and this has enormous consequences, is not trying to create a binary contrast between faith or faithfulness and actions, whether they're good deeds, whether they're rituals, or whether they're Jewish Torah observance. It's only one ritual, the ritual of ethnic transformation to becoming Jews. The binary is only what is faithfulness for a Jew. Circumcise your children. You don't even make this choice as a Jew.
Right.
For you. What is faithfulness for a non-Jew in Christ? Remaining a non-Jew in Christ, but now acting pretty Jewish, because you enter a Jewish community, a Jewish ethos, a Jewish culture, a Jewish way of understanding what righteousness and kindness and justice look like. That's what you, at his time, what did you have? The Torah. He appeals to the Torah as the authority for what's right or what's wrong. But he can't appeal to it if he's going to not let you become a Jew, he can't appeal to it as if you were under the Torah like a Jew is. The Torah was given to the Jews, not to the world.
Right.
But it is the basis for how the world should behave. And so this is this changes everything. It changes this whole kind of concept that faith and works are in some major theological, philosophical contrast. No.
Right.
Faithfulness is particularized. What's faithful for a wife in the relationship, for a child in the relationship, for the husband in the relationship, for the father in the relationship, for the son in the relationship, for the brother in the relationship, are not always the same at the same time in the same place.
Right.
And they're not the same for the non-Jew as they are for the Jew.
Yeah. So legalism, is that kind of the root of legalism, that idea? Like,
there's no legalism issue.
There is no legalism.
Legalism isn't an issue. Now, I think there are places where what we might call legalism comes up, because one can use the law to do that which is unlawful and immoral, right?
Okay.
And that can be exploited. So can circumcision. So can going to church on Sunday. So can anything. Praying for people, public venue can be an exploitation, an immoral act towards a way of gossiping, right?
Right.
We all know. So what do you mean it's wrong to pray about them? It's not wrong to pray about them. But but there is something wrong here. Can you not see that? This is kind of how legalism, but Paul's concern was not legalism. This was Luther's concern. Luther's concern was, legal ways in which Christians could try to avoid going to hell by raising money to pay for the building the Vatican or whatever indulgences and things like that rich people could pay for. He had those concerns. Jews didn't have that. He read that on to Jews. Jews didn't have that concern. It wasn't something what Paul was concerned with, because nobody else was doing that.
Right.
So it changes what we think was at issue. What was issue was what's faithful for you as a non-Jew who's come into Christ. And it was causing confusion in these communities because they're the outsiders. They don't know the culture. They want to just fit in. If I may, in the 60s in America, this is what blacks finally, part of the civil rights movement was finally saying, yeah, well, black is beautiful. Because what's going to become white to make this whole thing work on a white set of premises? And so how could they negotiate the boundary? Well, they turn it upside down, and you can't have what we have. And this is normal social processes. Social identity theory explains these kind of processes. And so what was happening in these groups is these non-Jews are coming in and they can't negotiate the boundary. They're not Jews. But they're joining a Jewish movement. How does that work? Don't we want to be Jews? And Paul won't let them. It's not that it's not important or not necessary or anything. That's not the point. You cannot, because you have to remain the other, the non-Jew in this movement. And that creates all kinds of problems, because this is a little subgroup of a few tens and hundreds of people in the Jewish world of, let's say, hundreds of thousands, millions. and nobody else agrees that this is the way you negotiate it. So you're guests and you're welcome and all that. But, like a Catholic would say, hey, you're not entitled to the sacraments. You're welcome and we'll
Right.
treat you with respect. But you got to become a Catholic if you want to be making those kind of claims. So that's why he writes these letters. And that's why he's talking about Erga Nomou versus pistis versus faithfulness, is that it's not for you. You already have the Spirit. If you try to do it, then logically you're saying you don't already have which it offers you. That's why he appeals to experience of the Spirit in Galatians, because you would be denying that which you already have. Well, what? You can't do that, can you? And
Right.
so that's what the argument's about, and it's a profound implications for how we read Paul.
Earlier, you talked about Gentiles, they behave Jewishly. And in your paper, you even say they behave Jewish-ishly.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? And
Yeah.
before you elaborate on it, it kind of makes me think of like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Messianic movement, but the
little bit.
Messianic Judaism, that's like sometimes an issue as far as, is there a distinction between the Jew and the Gentile, and how much does the Gentile do,
Mhm.
and so how does that apply to that kind of context, or does it?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a complicated one by the fact that we're living 2,000 years later, where
Right.
even Messianic Judaism is a form of Christianity in most cases.
Right. Yeah.
And the people that you're talking about are not just Gentiles; they're Christians. And so it's a little different than Paul's original thing, but there are analogies you can draw. The issue is when you have a group, you have certain identifications that are hierarchically ranked. I mean, this is normal. A group has certain norms, and certain people are the ideal that the norms are based on. In a Jewish group, being a Jew is kind of nice. Not being a Jew is hierarchically inferior, just by definition, right? Of group name. It's not Jewish. It's the same in a Catholic group. It's the same in a Baptist group. It's the same in doesn't matter what it is. You can deny it all you want, but I mean, this is the way it is. And so this was the big issue that some of Paul's letters are really wrestling with, trying to help guide these non-Jews how to negotiate equalness with difference, not erasing the difference, which is what Christianity tried to do. It thinks it erased the difference, but what it did was, which is normal in social movements and revolutions, it erases it in the opposite direction. Right?
We turn pendulum swings.
Exactly. If we turn this into the norm is Black culture in America, then we'll have made the same mistake that if the norm is white culture in America.
Right.
Norm should be all kinds of cultures in America, and figuring out a way that difference can be equal. Well, that's not that different than the Jewish project, and Paul was just a representative of the Jewish project, that if it's one God, then we ought to be able to be different and love each other and be equal and live in shalom. And so Paul believes that moment has arrived in a new kind of way, but it's not empirically verifiable. It should be in these groups, and the Spirit of God can help them, in theory, behave that way. It's hard to say there's a witness to that, but that is the claim. And I think the Messianic movement, when I learned about it, actually was after I wrote Mystery of Romans in the 90s. I learned about it from a local person, a group, and started to talk with them and some of the Messianic leaders in the United States. And one of the fascinating things is it happens in those groups for the Christians who come in who are not Jews. And they have a second-class citizen issue. Can they be the leader of the group? Can they marry the Jewish leader's child? Can they, blah, blah, blah. And so how they negotiate this. And I actually, talked with them a lot because they wanted to institute in a particular small group of Messianic Jews, wanted to begin to initiate proselyte conversion for their non-Jews. in order to negotiate this boundary in the classic way that Judaism came up with in the Greek period of Proselyte conversion. It's not in Torah, but it's there's lots of things that aren't in Torah that you figure out how to do. And so I don't know that there's anything problem with that if they want to be a Judaism, but if they want to be a Pauline kind of Judaism, then there's a problem with that, because that was a signifier for Paul of what made this movement different than other Judaisms. And so that's the problem. Hierarchical, social, different, having social difference is one thing, but hierarchically ranking that, like most people don't look at, I think I'm right about this. Most people don't notice your eye color and make a decision about your level of intelligence or opportunity or, whatever else. Skin color obviously has been a problem. But eye color, not usually. Hair color, we have a lot of jokes for blonde women, for example. There's a kind of can kind of laugh at it, but it's actually somewhat similar. There are things that become signifiers. And the project is that they shouldn't be. They're differences. Yeah, this is what the project is. And Erga Nomou, as long as you make Erga Nomou into thinking it's Jewish stuff or good deeds or something like that, you're creating a hierarchy between faith and deeds. And that creates all sorts of problems that the minister spends all their time trying to stop you from being. But while he's preaching just faith, he's actually saying, do the right thing. And that seems to me a problem that my approach would help Christians with. As an outsider, it seems to me that this would make more sense. But as a Jew and in terms of Judaism, it would certainly offer a helpful way to be more respectful. We're not different about the need to do the right thing. That's not our difference. Our difference is whether you're convinced about claims about Jesus. That's the difference. And while I'm on that, just as a slight segue, Jews don't believe this is true and reject it. They're being faithful to what they believe is true.
Right.
Another Christian way of a foil against Jews is if they're rejecting, not rejecting. Are Christians rejecting Islam when they're not persuaded that Muhammad is the prophet? They may or may not have ever investigated it. That's not the point. The point is, whatever they know through rumor or through a little bit of exposure or whatever it is, they're not persuaded and rejecting it. They're not persuaded. That's a whole
that's
different thing.
That's a good point. Yeah.
To what they are persuaded of about Jesus, not Moses, Moses or Muhammad or whatever else it is, And this is one of the payoffs for this is that we stop making, Christians can stop making Judaism something it isn't. And it's not the binary other, and it's not a rejection. It's a difference of opinion about the claims that are being made. Claims that are, by the way, not empirically verifiable. The world hasn't changed. Babies are still dying. Bad people are still winning. Hurricanes are still taking place.
Right.
The kingdom of God that is anticipated in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures is not here.
Right.
So what Paul was saying is we got to demonstrate that it's here by the way the Spirit of God lives among us by being different but respectful. And Erga Nomou has gotten in the way, I think, of understanding Paul's message about faithfulness and about loyalty and about behaving in love, actually.
Yeah. This understanding, I think it will really help us in understanding Paul, because I think sometimes when we read Paul, it seems like he's talking out of both sides of his mouth, right? Like in some parts of his letters, it seems like he's speaking positive about the law, but then in other parts, because of our interpretation, we think he's talking negatively about the law.
Right.
But with this view it gives us a continuity of Paul's thought.
Right. Again, going back to two daughters, right? Are you against books? Book reading? Are you against partying with friends? No. If you just take one snapshot and you universalize it, and especially if you don't have the other, I mean, we have very little evidence for Paul, what he would say in different situations and so on, and certainly not about modern situations.
Right.
So that, this is the point, is that Paul, when Paul is making comments that seem negative about what it means to be a Jew, or about what Torah can do or not do, he's making them to people who don't have the goods. I use this analogy sometimes. It might be helpful. If you go to the coffee shop and you meet a high school buddy, and let's say it's 10 years later, and you drive up in your Mercedes-Benz, and they drive up in their 25-year-old trashed out car that they're obviously living in, and you go have coffee, and you say, hey, the car doesn't make the man. What you drive doesn't make any difference at all. But you know what? You get back in your Mercedes. So this is how rhetoric has to be qualified.
Right. Yeah.
Paul is a Pharisee. He knows the Torah. He's a Jew. Nobody's arguing that he doesn't have the qualifications, but he's not allowing the non-Jews to get the qualifications. They're marginalized. He has to say to them, hey, the law is not the end of the deal. If you have the Spirit of God, you can get the same place I can get. And in fact, we're celebrating you turning to the Son and crying out Pater while we cry out Abba, because it's the same God, the same Creator God. And so the fact that I'm a big shot Jew really doesn't matter in that context. But what does Paul do? Does he then give up his Jewish identity? He's using his Jewish identity to make the case. If he's not Jewish and you don't know it, he can't make this statement. It has no real teeth to it rhetorically.
Right.
The way you have to qualify it, Paul doesn't say anything really negative about Torah. He thinks Torah is fabulous. But since you're not under it as a non-Jew, he's got to figure out how to get you there. And in 1 Corinthians 8:10, that's what he's doing. He's saying, if a Jew asks him, hey, can we eat idol food? He'd say, what, are you, an idiot? The Torah says we can't eat it. But for a non-Jew who's come to Christ, and all their family, their worker, their whole town, everything they are, eats idol food and libates the wine, how are they going to live in the world? That's a little phrase in there, right? How are they going to live in the world?
Right.
Paul can't just get the Torah out and say, well, you're Jews. You can't, he didn't allow them to be Jews. He says, well, we know, there's no such thing as those gods, because they're saying, hey, well, we don't honor those gods as gods anymore, so why can't we eat it? It's not sacred to us. Paul says, yeah, but it wasn't sacred to Israel, and you're not allowed to eat at the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So he gets you to the same place that Torah teaches. That's the Jewishishness.
Right.
Right? He appeals to Scripture, he appeals to Torah, but you're not under Torah. He appeals to first principles. He appeals to logic. He appeals to love of neighbor. He appeals to concern with what the other person will deduce from your behavior. And all of it lines up. Early Christianity looks like a kind of Judaism. And so too does, much of Christianity. Many of the moral and ritual aspects of it are based on on Judaism. If you didn't have Scripture, you wouldn't have Christianity looking like it looks. If you didn't have Jewish Scripture that it was interacting with and measuring itself by.
Right.
So that's what I mean by Jewishishness, is that, they don't become Jews, but the culture is Judaism. It's a Jewish way of life created by Jews for Jews, and now non-Jews are also experiencing it, being enculturated into it and confused. Because where you have difference, you generally have discrimination.
Right.
This project says you have difference and you should not discriminate. In ways, this is like the American experiment in some ways, with differences. But
right.
That's one of the reasons Paul, I think, resonates, actually, too. is that, with Americans and with people of the West or other places that are seeking to allow difference and be respectful, that it's not just Paul. It's just, this is in Judaism.
Right. So in your paper, you focus a lot on the books of Galatians and Romans.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done any study like in Ephesians, First Timothy? I think Ephesians has, I think it's in 2:9 where he talks about works, but it's just works.
Yeah.
Is he saying the same thing? Do you think?
I can't tell you right off the top. I haven't worked that much with it, but
Okay.
when ergon singular is used, there can be all kinds of meanings, just like in the English language. For works, you could be talking about going to the office, and you could be talking about good deeds, and you could be talking about the public water system works. And there's all kinds of ways that a word like that could be functioning in any given context. The only two places where he uses Erga Nomou are in Romans 3 and 4 and Galatians 2 and 3.
Right.
And so in those contexts, you have to be careful where you see either nomos or ergon functioning separately, because he's already dealing with both. He's dealing with a certain contextualized meaning. But outside of that, there's no reason to necessarily expect that he's talking about the same thing.
Okay.
It could be, but not necessarily. And in the case of Ephesians and Timothy, of course, you have, at least according to common Pauline scholarship today, that they're post-Paul. And so they would be readers of Paul's literature who may or may not use his language in certain ways in different contexts. And they may or may not represent what Paul himself may have meant, which we don't know. But anyway, our best reading of what Paul might have meant and what people, the next generation, understood him to mean, because pretty soon he was understood to mean Judaism's bad, Torah's bad, so on, and Christianity and faith are good. That happened very quickly, and we have so-called Paulinism. But I don't think that's what Paul was doing. It already starts, though, in the New Testament. So he's quickly misunderstood. I think misunderstood. Some would say he's understood correctly.
Right.
But I think he's misunderstood.
Yeah, I think Acts 21 proves evidence of that, right? When James says, "Hey, there's people saying you're telling Jews not to circumcise their sons according to the law of Moses," and he's like, "We know this isn't true."
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Paul does a Nazirite vow, which
Right.
a ritual in the temple to prove that he doesn't teach something against Torah.
Which is above and beyond the Torah. You don't have to do a Nazirite vow. That's like something you do to like attain extra holiness, right?
That's right. He's showing this is a rumor that's untrue.
Right.
I teach non-Jews not to get circumcised, Erga Nomou. But I don't teach Jews not to get circumcised, to circumcise their sons. That is a rumor, and it's an easy rumor to develop. It's very understandable why that would have developed quickly. I actually think Paul, prior to his revelatory experience, whatever that was someone who was advocating proselyte conversion, and that's why he's so focused on it. He thought, I think the movement was already not doing that. The movement of James and Peter and so on that preceded him, they were not circumcising these non-Jews because they thought the end of the ages had arrived. The very ideas that Paul propagates. Right. And that's his big change. And that's why it's so significant to him, because he had tried to stop the movement for that particular reason. So he's an advocate of proselyte conversion. So he becomes very focused on what's wrong with that and how it defines this movement, because that's how it defined the movement for him as an outsider against it. And so it becomes the truth of the gospel. This is the focal thing. And I don't think for other people, it maybe was as other leaders of this movement, it may not have been as much a focal point. because they didn't start out opposing the movement maybe for that particular reason. Maybe they opposed it for some other messianic kind of claim or some other aspect of social behavior or something like that. So naturally, their Christ faithfulness focused on something different than that. But I think that's why Paul focused on that.
That's good. How has the, like, I know we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the interview, but how has the scholarly community embraced this this perspective? Have you, have there been some positive feedback? I know that you said, a lot of people were kind of rejecting it, but has there been any positive feedback?
Yes, of course. Yes, the movement is growing, not only to read Paul within Judaism, but to read the gospel writers. There's a John within Judaism movement. There's a book, Matthew within Judaism now, a big fat book from conferences. There's Mark within Judaism, a dissertation on that's being published, and discussions. John within Judaism. Of course, Acts would be easy to do within Judaism. I expect. Well, actually, there's a book that will come out that I'm going to contribute to an edited volume that will be about within Judaism, the New Testament within Judaism, and it'll have all these different aspects of it. It just makes sense. It just makes sense. If there's no Christianity, then what are the choices?
Right.
So in that sense, it's doing really well. And the Paul within Judaism part is, it's growing. There are different responses. Some will use it because it's logical, but what they still mean is Christianity. They just change, that's how games are played with words and concepts. But I think things are changing in some ways, but there's a lot of resistance. Once you get to, and it's really always stayed about at the same point. It's one thing to focus on Paul's ethnicity as a Jew, but when you start to say, no, he continued to observe Torah. He never would have eaten idol food or pork or this sort of thing, that he was known to be practicing Judaism, and that these other people were coming into a Jewish way of life, practices with Sabbath and so on. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where there's resistance, because it's been part of Christian ideology, theology, that's anathema. It's the opposite of what happened. And so if you've been trained in that, if you've lived by that, as has been a guiding principle for what it means for you, well, obviously there's something to be resisted. So, it's, and it often brings up the same question I think you were sort of getting at with Messianics, but often people will come up to me after a lecture or something, and after reading me, and they'll say, well, what am I supposed to do as a Christian? Am I supposed to become Jewish? Am I supposed to go to the synagogue? Because people, for the people, this is not just a historical interest. This is a part of defining who they are and how they see the world.
Right.
And it disrupts the familiar, the given, the fact that I breathe air. And ideology is that which can't be explained, right? It's what you're a part of, and it's unexamined, and it's no need to defend it. And when somebody comes along and makes you need to think about it, that creates problems. And there's various strategies, from ignoring it, dismissing it, misrepresenting it, ad hominems, so on.
What's one of the common ways that they misrepresent your perspective?
Well, there are actually so many, but one that's really common right now in trying to define what makes Paul within Judaism movement is to say that Paul is only writing to non-Jews, and therefore his communities are non-Jewish, churches or communities, Gentile churches, Gentile communities, and that he has nothing to say to Jews, or there's no Jews present. That's not what I'm saying. Jews run these groups. I don't know how many Jews and non-Jews are present. I'm saying that the ideal audience that he's trying to convince of something or persuade or challenge are the non-Jews in the audience. But you know how rhetoric works. When you say one thing to one daughter, you might hope that the other daughter's listening, and you frame it in such a way that they'll be instructed by it too.
Right.
He's instructing the Jews how they should be interacting with the non-Jews indirectly. By the way, he's instructing the non-Jews that they should understand themselves and how they interact with Jews. I don't know how many Jews are present, but I'm claiming that these are Jewish subgroup assemblies. So there are Jews there, and they're interacting with Jews who believe in Christ. There might be a few. And I mean, these communities, I think, are made up of 10, 20, 30, 40 people. They're not big. And so most of the Jews around are not Christ followers, probably. And most of the non-Jews around in these Jewish groups, Jewish communities, are not Christ followers either. And I think that, when a person creates the kind of correspondence he does, they have in mind all sorts of other listeners. So that's a misrepresentation that gets into a historical, not just a rhetorical audience question, but a historical audience question, thinking that they're all Gentiles, that they're separated from synagogues when, now they're Christian synagogues. Well, that's not what I'm saying. There's subgroups like charismatic groups in the 70s were in Episcopalian churches or Catholic churches or something. There are subgroups that are part of the group, and it creates identity problems, right? If in the 70s, at least, which when I can speak to the 60s and 70s, when I was in college and I was meeting people that were like this, those subgroup, if you came into the subgroup as a charismatic group that met on Wednesday nights, not at the church, right? At somebody's house or some other, university classroom, wherever it might be, and you got enculturated into charismaticism, and then you went to the Episcopalian or Catholic church on Sundays, eventually you would probably start doing that, right? You'd find out that things are not as you supposed. This is not, people aren't standing up and doing those kinds of things with
Right.
the mainline body. And so you have to then figure out who you are, how you fit in, right? And your leader's got to help you negotiate that. And he may well say, well, you've got it right and they've all got it wrong, kind of stuff you see Paul writing about. And but I have to put it in its rhetorical perspective that he is trying to help you negotiate something that's pretty confusing because what you've been told is not being verified by your peers when you go there. That's how I see these movements. They're within Jewish communities who meet in homes, who meet in all kinds of spaces. They may have a specialized building in a bigger city, but they're community centers, and they have all kinds of subgroups. And this is one of the weird subgroups that, if non-Jews are introduced to this, they have expectations that are not confirmed by the rest of the Jewish community and by the larger non-Jewish community around them.
Right.
You can become a proselyte. I'd understand you. I might not like it, but what you're claiming doesn't make sense on any kind of terms that we know, right? You don't do the household or the civic cults, but you're not a Jew. That's not acceptable. I mean, at least we know Jews don't do it. It's like the Amish don't send their boys to Vietnam to the service, but they do the peace service. Well, they're Amish. We get it. They're weird. They have special privileges, but you're not Amish, young man. So just because you go to a Amish meeting doesn't make you Amish.
Right.
So this is the kind of, real social issues that were taking place. So that's a misrepresentation that, kind of a simple misrepresentation. I think the biggest one, though, is actually not a misrepresentation so much about what I'm saying about Paul, is why I'm saying it. And that is to say, I'm only trying to make Christians be nice to Jews, post-Holocaust sensibilities and things like that. And while that does motivate me for sure, otherwise I wouldn't bother with this if I didn't think it, there was a payoff there.
Right.
That's not what I'm doing. I'm doing exegesis. So that's an ad hominem, right? That's saying don't have to listen to him because he has a present contextual concern. And you'll see this almost everywhere in people relating about this who don't want their leader to think they have to take it that seriously, but they want to tell them about it.
I think I've heard N.T. Wright use that argument.
Oh yeah, he's used it, but so have almost Bird has used it. Almost everybody uses it because if they're just trying to show, hey, I'm aware and I'll put this out there. Well, guess what? First of all, that's naive. What you're doing is interested. nobody would be listening to it if it didn't have any currency for them today. What do you think you're doing? Well, why do you think you're doing it? That doesn't tell me anything. You do exegesis and I have to engage it. I do exegesis and you have to engage it. It doesn't matter who I am or how qualified I am. It matters what I do. And that's the biggest misrepresentation, is that we're just ideologues. And the fact is that we're doing our work too, to be exegetes. We're doing the same hard work. In fact, our work's harder. We can't just cobble together what other people before us said and repeat it with our own little twist on it. We have to actually go to the text and start over. It takes a long time. It's hard work. And to dismiss it that way is one of the biggest misrepresentations of what's taking place here. It's a way of gatekeeping, of telling your readers, your ideal readers or listeners, that you don't have to pay any attention to this. It's just it's a sideshow, and it'll disappear. And it may. I mean, who knows? Those strategies can work.
Right. How many scholars would you say are in the Paul within Judaism camp?
Well, I don't know. We did the Paul Within Judaism book with Fortress in 2015, and there was about 10 or so contributors to that. There's been at least 10 or 20 other people who've published or published papers or books who identify in some way with it. I have no idea how many more people are. I find people all the time say, well, yeah, I'm teaching in my class, or I introduce it to it, or whatever. I really have no idea where we are on that kind of scale. But I think it's probably fair to say, based on what's published in most commentaries still, that we haven't made that much of an impression on, the normative processes at seminaries, at those who represent the field in assigned handbooks, commentaries, and things like that. But it's changing. There's a new Oxford, I don't know what it's called exactly, handbook on Paul, that has contributors and editors who are Paul within Judaism people. There's a new T&T Clark handbook of the historical Paul, to which I contributed, and some others with Paul within Judaism perspective. So it's starting to happen in some places. Brian Tucker has contributed to some commentaries on Corinthians in some series, actually pretty conservative series. That's an unusual case, but I think things are happening. It's really hard to know how it will play out and how it will be. I really don't know about that. I'm just like anybody else. I just got to put my head down and do the work, and I can't determine what the outcome will be.
Yeah, where it lands. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to jump into our fivefold inquiry.
Okay.
Number one, do you have any hobbies besides reading Paul within Judaism?
Yeah, well, I do. I'm a golfer. Most of my adult life, a runner and a cyclist. A little bit less of those lately. And yeah, that's.
Do you run marathons, or just run for fun, or
5K or type?
5K
a week type.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Nice.
And bicycling mostly. I commuted to university. Now that I'm not teaching at university, I'm a little less interested. Plus, I also rode a bike partly for the health issues related to knees to run.
All right. Yeah.
Running less because my back, as I get older, it doesn't like the compression that takes place. So I can run on the beach more so than on the street.
Okay. Cool.
But golf is something you can keep doing for a while.
Yeah, that's a frustrating game, man. I used to do it a lot at my last job, just with customers and stuff. And I always say I try to play golf.
Yeah. It's it was invented by Calvinists to make you aware that there's no good thing in you, and it works.
Yeah. All right, number 2, are there any new projects or books that you're working on?
Well, I'm trying to finish my 4th volume of collected essays, which is focused on papers that have been published and some unpublished in Galatians.
Okay.
That's my current major thing. I have some conference papers I'm working on. As I say, one for a new book that, well, maybe I didn't mention, but a new book that's coming out. Yeah, I did mention a New Testament within Judaism, and I'm contributing something to that I'm working on now. And I have 2 or 3 book projects that, I mean, much of the work's been done for years on the allegory in Galatians, on evil eye, on Erga Nomou, fuller work on that, commentary on Romans that I've intended to do and done a lot of work on, and likewise on Galatians.
Well, I look forward to those.
Thanks.
Okay, here's some good ones. What is justification?
Yeah, well, that's the quick question. Quick answer to that is, I think a better translation, a defamiliarizing translation of this word, of the dikaio related words, is around legitimation.
Legitimation.
And the reason I say this, justification is fine, but legitimation, just to get you thinking. The question is it legitimate to claim that non-Jews in Christ are full members of the people of God without becoming Jews, i.e., Erga Nomou? Is it faithfulness for a non-Jew? What our community claims, our little Christ-following community, Paul would say, claims, is that it's legitimate. And everyone else says it's not legitimate until the end of the ages arrives. And he says, well, it's arrived. Jesus is Messiah. And they say, well, no, I don't know. It doesn't seem to have arrived. So it's not legitimate. Well, we have a legitimate way of doing it. Become a proselyte.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because it seems like justification, or this idea of legitimization, is kind of usually connected with salvation. And that, like, it's just if you have never sinned or something. That's usually how some pastors will say it. But when he's using the word, he's actually specifically talking about the Gentile. Are they a legitimate part of Israel, basically?
Yep.
A legitimate part of the Commonwealth of Israel.
Yeah, the people of God. There's Israel and the nation. Is this legit?
Right. Wow.
Is it legit for Jews like himself and the other Jews who teach this? Is it legit for them to teach it?
Right.
Is it legit for you to believe it? Is it legit for you to act on it? It's not legit in the larger society. Non-Jews think you should do cult. What's expected of you, or the gods will be mad, and the fellow citizens and family will be mad. Jews think that you should remain a guest and do that cult unless you're going to become a Jew, in which case then you do the cult related to the one God. That's what's legit.
Okay. And kind of connected to that, number 4, what is salvation?
Well, the Greek word sozo actually doesn't mean saved the way that's usually used in evangelical and therefore in most Christian discourse. In antiquity, sozo, and you can go to a regular Greek lexicon, it's used to mean protected, kept safe. So when when you say, well, the doctor saved my life, you don't usually mean the same thing you would say if your doctor resuscitated me. I died on the table and he brought me back to life. When you say he saved my life, you mean he kept you from dying. He kept you safe. He protected you. And that's the way it is normally used. So the issue in Paul's letters when talking about Jewish people is they're still in the covenant and they need to be protected. And God's doing something strange here, or this anomalous moment where non-Jews are coming in, and because the end of the age claims of the gospel. And Paul thinks that all Israel should be participating in this bringing in the non-Jews. But if you're not persuaded that it's appropriate, then that it's legit, that it's justified, then you won't participate in it. And he believes they'll be protected until. It's kind of like disciplining a child. You don't throw them out of the family normally when they misbehave.
Right.
You discipline them. you're protecting them from becoming an outlaw when they grow up, and thinking that what's normal is bad stuff. And so you protect the family, you protect the neighborhood, you protect the child by discipline.
Right.
And that's what sozo is mostly about. And the issue is, can non-Jews who were worshiping the wrong gods and behaving in terrible ways, can they also be protected? Yeah, they can be, but they have to make a major turn,
Right.
a change of commitment.
And what are they being protected from?
Yeah, they're being protected from being destroyed.
From being
They are
destroyed.
the outlaws.
Right.
Right? They're being protected from God's wrath because they're not only destroying the world that God made and destroying each other and behaving in awful ways and worshiping the wrong gods, but they're harming the people that do belong to God. They're keeping them from being able to behave according to the standards of Torah, and they're destroying their land, and they're controlling their opportunities for how they perform cult and live. So they're being protected too, so that for that day to come when they can get it right.
Okay. Last question. We've talked a lot of, we've kind of covered a lot of issues, but is there one question that you wish I would have asked you?
Oh no, I think you've done a real nice job, and we've covered a lot of ground in a short time. I hope it's clear for your listeners, and I hope it creates some curiosity to go have a look at some of the arguments that have been made.
Yeah. As somebody that's like, I don't know, kind of new to this perspective, is there a book that you would recommend for them to kind of jump in and get their feet wet?
Well, the Paul Within Judaism volume I co-edited with Magnus Zetterholm is written for that kind of person. And then my own collected essays called Reading Paul Within Judaism is one of what would be 4 volumes of essays. And that I would also recommend. And Paula Fredrickson has a book called Paul the Pagan's Apostle, she's a very readable scholar.
Yeah, she's good. Yeah,
I recommend that as well. And Magnus Zetterholm has a book called what's it called? Approaches to Paul, I think, which outlines various the classical and other kind of common perspectives, but also development of this perspective in chapters towards the end of that.
Okay.